This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review. I'm your host, Gilad Halpern.
And I'm your co-hostess, Dalia Shenlin.
Every week we bring you conversations with authors about the books and research and other things that we like. And if you like us, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter by going to our homepage. That's tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review. All you have to do is scroll down to the bottom and click the big red button that says Patreon. Click and support us because we are counting on you. And this episode is part of a series in partnership with the Israel office of the Konrad Adenauer Foundation that's focused on democracy, populism, authoritarianism, and all of its causes, symptoms, and manifestations.
And we're very pleased today to welcome Milan Svolik. He's a professor of political science at Yale University, and he's speaking to us from New Haven today. His research and teaching focus on comparative politics, political economy, and formal political theories. Svolik has authored and co-authored articles on the politics of authoritarian regimes and democratization. He's the author of The Politics of Authoritarian Rule, published by Cambridge University Press in 2012, and other recent articles that we will be discussing today, including projects on democratic backsliding, polarization, and the role of the public within these phenomena. Milan Svolik, welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Great. Let's start with the question of the public, a personal favorite of mine since I moonlight as a public opinion researcher myself. Knowing what we know about the democratic paradox that voters throughout the 20th century, it's not exactly new, have demonstrated the capacity to vote freely for undemocratic regimes or regimes that become undemocratic. How strong is the notion among the community of political theorists and political scientists that the public should be expected to represent some sort of a backstop on undemocratic leadership?
I think this is a key question, and I think of it as primarily an empirical question, and a question that we, up to now, I think have very limited tools to assess. And let me explain why. So one challenge in understanding whether and how people can stop politicians with authoritarian tendencies is that it is really hard to deduce from actual real-world events whether they are voting against a politician that undermines democracy because that politician undermines democracy or for some other reasons. And maybe that question has even more resonance when we phrase it the other way around. So when we see the public voting for politicians that undermine democracy, think Orban, Erdogan, or Trump, it's not clear at all whether they are actually voting for them precisely because of that, or possibly in spite of that. That is, there are many things that they may like about those politicians, and they may actually dislike that they are being undemocratic. But crucially, they may be willing to make trade-offs and accept a politician who is somewhat undemocratic, but delivers on many other issues, then vote for someone who is democratic, but doesn't deliver on what that particular voter cares about. First principles would make us think that voters really value democracy. They should value it because elections and democracy give them instruments to hold politicians accountable. But whether they are willing to make the kind of trade-offs that I just pointed to, that's a separate question. Parts of electorate may be willing to make them, others may be willing to resist them.
And why is it important?
It is important because that's one potential explanation why we observe so many publics being willing to put up with politicians who undermine democracy. When we ask people directly, say in surveys, how important is it for you to live in a country that's governed democratically, the vast majority of democratic publics will, on a scale from 0 to 10, where 10 means democracy is absolutely essential, answer close to that end. And even though recently we have seen some research that indicates that that kind of metric, even there we might see some decline in support for democracy, for the vast majority of democracies, that answer is somewhere in the range of 8, 9 out of 10. And that's where the puzzle comes in, which is why would publics that, according to this one metric, but many others too, profess a commitment to democracy, why would they be at the same time willing to able to vote for politicians who undermine democracy? So that I think is the key question that we have to ask
I think it's the key question of the world right now. And I want to ask you one of the things that I think is always on my mind when I look at this phenomenon, which is, are we sure that the voters making that choice to vote for leaders who we think they should already understand that they have undemocratic leanings, are we sure that they see it that way? Because in some of the material, I think in the article particularly that you've authored with your co-author Matthew Graham, you develop a very careful design to phrase the tests of these undemocratic statements that politicians make in ways that they would encounter them in the real world, and often in ways that sound incremental and sort of neutral and even legitimizing. Do we know that the voters really understand the implications and the consequences of some of the policies they're being presented with when they go to vote?
So maybe before I answer this specific question, let me just clarify what the context is that you just described. So one way that I and my co-authors, and including Matt, who has collaborated with me on projects on the US, one way we try to get at whether people are possibly making trade-offs between democracy and other political values they care about, let's say positional issues, policies, and so on, is that we faced respondents in surveys with a choice of two politicians that will be described precisely by the kind of policies that we typically see in everyday politics. But then crucially, and at random, some of those politicians would be also described as endorsing a measure that's undemocratic. And because it is at random, essentially the flip of a coin, we know that we have a baseline where some politicians would be perfectly democratic. And so I can figure out how you would vote if both those politicians were perfectly democratic. And then we have a subset of choices in which one of the politicians behaves undemocratically. And so I can deduce from this data what fraction of an electorate, in this case the American electorate, would be willing to defect from, abandon a politician just because that politician is behaving undemocratically. And in the US, we found that that percentage is somewhere between 3.5 and 13% of the electorate, depending on what kind of measure and what kind of experimental design you use. But your question speaks to a separate issue, which is now when an American respondent sees a pair of candidates like these, and one of them is described as maybe endorsing what is implied to be a gerrymandering scheme, do they actually know it? And this is a tough one for the following reason. If you ask people directly, is this politician being undemocratic because he's doing X, introducing voter ID laws? The supporters of that politician will defend that politician and claim that what he's doing, in fact, is perfectly democratic. My colleagues at Yale refer to this as cheerleading. That is, instead of answering the question directly, they use it as an opportunity to express an approval for the politician that we're asking about. And this happens routinely in the United States, where those who defend, for instance, voter ID laws or redistricting schemes that favor their party will claim that, no, this is perfectly democratic. And so a direct question just doesn't give us to what seems like a credible answer. So what Matt and I did in the US study, for instance, 2 weeks before administering these experiments, instead of asking about the United States, we asked about around the world. In other words, we asked the following question. Here is a set of practices from around the world. Please tell us whether you think they're democratic or not. But intentionally among these, we included precisely the kind of positions that the candidates in our experiment would be endorsing and that are undemocratic. And these were also mixed with many other positions that are perfectly democratic. And the finding from this little exercise is that Americans are pretty good at distinguishing what is democratic from what is undemocratic.
Just not when it comes to them.
Precisely, but when it comes to the US context, then they will tell you that even things that are clearly to a political scientist undemocratic, to them, they may present them as being democratic. But my interpretation is not because they don't know it, but because they want to express an approval for the politician that is endorsing those positions.
Or could the politicians not only be gathering their support as cheerleading, but misleading their voters? I mean, maybe in the American context, the politicians are defending practices that when portrayed neutrally in another country sound pretty okay. But when your politician is making the case in the context of your neighborhood or your state in America and you're familiar with it, To what extent is the notion of really misleading or even lying part of the debate that helps advance undemocratic policies?
So I think this is an important point in the following sense, that essentially since the end of the Cold War, being democratic has held such a strong legitimating value that it is really hard to find a politician who undermines democracy and sincerely admits to doing so. Right? Most politicians who undermine democracy will claim that, in fact, what they are doing is improving democracy, or in fact, coming up with a new, better version of democracy, right? So when you think about Putin's sovereign democracy or Orban's versions of democracy, Chavez's Bolivarian democracy in Venezuela. And so just like these prominent examples, even everyday politicians, when they are doing something undemocratic, they do it under the pretense of, in fact, correcting some democratic deficit. So in the United States, the typical language is that voter ID laws, in fact, serve to prevent election fraud that we know does not happen in any meaningful way, with any meaningful quantities. But nonetheless, this is used as a justification. And so the question is, yes, can voters tell these undemocratic practices apart? But that is precisely the purpose of this, what I call around the world battery that we administer in many countries where I'm running these experiments. And throughout, publics are very good at telling, especially the cruder measures apart. Meaning, if a politician wants to, is claiming not to concede an election that he just lost, or wants to appoint politically friendly judges, or dismiss government employees that might be opposed to the incumbent party, and so on. When asked about the rest of the world, they clearly are able to see that this is undemocratic. But crucially, when asked about their own country and the politician that they like, they are willing then to posture and pretend like it's perfectly democratic.
The end of the Cold War that you just alluded to is also meaningful in another way, and that is that, as you point out in one of your articles, it's also a turning point in the history of democratic backsliding, in the sense that there are more and more, there's been an exponential growth in the number of leaders and politicians who started safely within the democratic campaign and have been eating away at it gradually. And I mean, this is apparent in many places, both in the former communist bloc, but also in the West, where liberal democracy is supposed to be king. And I'm asking myself why that is, and whether it's because up until that point, democracy was some sort of an existential guarantee, and with the disappearance of the number one threat to the free world, that being the USSR and the communist bloc, it did not have to be safeguarded in the same way. And that is something that pervaded both the political elite and the people themselves.
Mm-hmm. So getting a historically correct picture of democratic backsliding, I think, is extremely important. And maybe in addressing what you just summarized, the kind of historical development that appears to be happening after the end of the Cold War, and maybe with even more force, let's say in the 2010s, that is an increase in democratic backsliding. I think when we look at it historically, I would in fact suggest that our view of the historical trajectory of regime change and democratic stability might somewhat be distorted by what was the predominant form of democratic breakdown during the Cold War and before. And that is what I'm pointing to, is that before the 1990s, the primary form, at least the most visible form, of the breakdown of democracy was an intervention by a military coup. Right? So this is what we have happening in Chile in 1973. This is what more recently happened in Egypt and Myanmar. Now, because this is the Cold War, or even prior to the Cold War, this sets a very stark contrast to something that we today call democratic backsliding. That is, when, let's say, in the 1960s or the 1970s, a democratically elected incumbent was playing with district boundaries to make it easier for his party to maintain a legislative majority, or maybe intimidating judges who were ruling against his party, that looked very tame compared to an Argentine military junta torturing prisoners or dissidents in the Soviet Union disappearing into psychiatric hospitals. Right? So in other words, there may have been quite a lot of democratic backsliding going on prior to the 1990s. But because the undemocratic baseline was so low, so stark, we might have been willing to overlook it. These, the Orbáns of the 1960s and 1970s might have looked pretty good compared to what was going on in the world of dictatorship. But after the 1990s, military interventions become much rare. The Leninist format of governing a dictatorship disappears. 50% of it, at least 50% of it disappears. And so suddenly, I think we have a much clearer view of how many incumbents are abusing their power to undermine democracy and perpetuate their power. In other words, a lot of democratic backsliding may have been going on prior to the 1990s, but we get a much clearer view of it after the 1990s, when these other forms, these extreme forms of democratic breakdown, they do not disappear, but they become more rare.
And one of the things I appreciated about a 2019 article of yours called Polarization versus Democracy was that you give a sort of typology of democratic decline, and I'd like you to explain them because I think they're useful categories. You talk about, you just mentioned already military coups, the kind that are, big, splashy, and obvious, but tell us about executive takeover, deliberalization, and deterioration. Which are the most common kinds, and why do these distinctions matter so much?
So, you just referred to the executive takeover, which is something that I associate with democratic backsliding. That is, when we hear the term democratic backsliding, the language evokes the fact that this is a gradual, often legalistic. It's something that takes place over several election cycles. And it's clearly done with the intent to undermine democracy. But one key feature is that the term itself does not contain that this is done by democratically elected incumbents. And that, I think, is key in this context. And that differentiates it from these other ways in which democracies have broken down historically, with interventions by the military coups being the major alternative form of breakdown. And the conceptual difference that I see as key here is that whereas the military is an actor that's intervening from outside the world of institutionalized politics, incumbents and democratic backsliding happen from within democracy itself. So this is a threat to democracy from within democracy. And what I see essential about it is also that it starts from a democratic status quo. And what I see as key about it is that, therefore, voters must be active participants in it, if in no other way than in failing to stop an incumbent who is undermining democracy. And to put some quantities on this, after the end of the Cold War, we see in relative magnitudes way more democracies breaking down because incumbents subvert democracy than because outside non-institutional actors like militaries intervene in democracies. If I remember correctly, the counts, after the 2010s, this is a 4-to-1 or a 5-to-1 ratio. Many more democracies, way many more democracies, decline because incumbents subvert them from within than because militaries intervene in them.
I mean, does anybody even need to argue that? Because we have the most stunning example just from this earlier this year in the United States when America, I think, arguably came closest to exactly what you're talking about relative to any other time certainly in the post-war years and maybe ever. Would you say that's an example of what you're talking about? The military didn't intervene, but an elected incumbent did things that stood to undermine American democracy. Is that a good example?
I think it's a great example, and it's the starkest example in the sense that the United States is one of the longest-lived democracies in the world. It's a country that has served as an archetype of what should be done to have a long-lived, functioning democracy. And therefore, it's highly unexpected too, right, that something like this would happen in a case like the United States.
So to what extent do you think the institutional context plays a role here? Say, if Trump had stayed in power long enough, would he have become an Erdogan or an Orban? Is no democratic system, however robust and veteran, immune from this kind of backsliding? Is it just one big continuum?
I think it's really hard to answer the counterfactual of what would have happened. I'm glad it is not happening. We don't see it in real life. I think conceptually the question I would ask about this specific case is, was Trump, in spite of everything that happened, potentially still moderating himself? And were those around him moderating him, potentially by departures from his cabinet and so on, because there was the need to get reelected? So when I, in a hypothetical scenario, imagine Trump in a second term and that threat of non-reelection not being a constraint, I'm imagining things that are way worse than happened during his first term.
Another thing about these authoritarian leaders, as you point out in your work, is that they're not just populist, they're also very popular. They enjoy great popular support from the public. So I wonder, why do you think they opt for this sort of authoritarianism and democratic backsliding in the first place? I've often thought about this in relation to Benjamin Netanyahu's constant attacks on the media, because if, as he says, the media bend over backwards to kick him out of office, at the end of the day, they do a terrible job at it because he keeps getting reelected. So why does he bother in the first place? It's sort of a paradox that can be applied also to, Vladimir Putin and his tendency to eliminate his political opponents in all sorts of unsavory ways, or maybe Erdogan's attacks on the independence of the judiciary in Turkey and other such forms. Why do you think this tendency even exists?
To answer your question, I would separate two issues. One is the opportunism of the elites, and the other is the structural conditions in the electorate that allow for this to happen. The opportunism of the elites is something that I think is hard to explain other than maybe for a political realist to consider it something natural, right? So if we have a very Machiavellian view of politics, that we should not be surprised that many political elites, when in office, when controlling power, make steps to make that power firmer and to allow themselves to perpetuate in power. So that I don't see as puzzling. Maybe what I would see as puzzling are politicians who resist that temptation. But what I see as the puzzling issue here is, why do the publics let them do this? And here I think many of the politicians that you mentioned take advantage of two distinct structural advantages. And one relates to polarization. If you have a divided society, be it along economic lines, ethnic lines, social divisions, then they know that even if they act undemocratically, and even if their own supporters value democracy, they may be willing to look the other way because they hate the alternative even more. Right? So in other words, these voters are making a trade-off between a politician I like, but undemocratic, and a politician I dislike and potentially democratic. And they're willing to live with it. The other kind of trade-offs that I see in a lot of these cases is when the politician in power, rather than being on one side of a highly divided society, is instead somebody who, maybe because of a combination of deserving it and of luck, has acquired a reputation for being a competent politician, a competent head of government. And this is where I think someone like Putin or Erdogan are good examples. Turkey may be a society that's divided along many lines, but crucially, for instance, if you look at Turkey's GDP per capita during the first decade of Erdogan's tenure as prime minister, that GDP per capita has tripled under Erdogan. Now, that's something where if you're the typical Turkish voter, what you're then facing when you're thinking and when you're seeing Erdogan behaving undemocratically, you're thinking, I have this politician who has delivered so much economic growth to Turkey, who is also acting undemocratically, and then I have the opposition who has no such accomplishments and who claims to be democratic. I think it's fairly easy to understand that a large share of the Turkish electorate may be willing to live with that kind of trade-off. I would refer this as a trade-off between valence and democracy that many are willing to make. And this is similar, I would interpret the first years of Putin's tenure in a very similar fashion. Compared to the chaos of the Yeltsin years, Putin looked very good early in his tenure to many Russians.
I think this raises a few points that explain the initial question we started with, which is why would the public vote for people who may be undermining their democracy? And you've pointed out in this part of the conversation what you yourself define as self-interest, that individual voters might see their self-interest as trumping their support, so to speak, for principles of democracy. But you have a few other ideas in there, too, that help to explain it. One is pure partisanship. I mean, even if a voter doesn't identify a particular self-interest, like my personal income levels, the person might just say, as you also alluded to in the beginning, I'm on that side of the divide. My candidate maybe is playing fast and loose with democracy, but that's where I identify, so I'd rather support that candidate. And then there's another aspect, which is commitment to a specific policy, such as I want a candidate or a leader who is anti-immigration or anti-LGBT rights or some other particular policy. If we think about those three, self-interest, partisanship, or commitment to a particular policy, can you, in a way, rank those as which is the most likely to cause a voter to give up on democratic principles, or do they all simply kind of act together in concert?
So this is a tough question, because what you're essentially asking is about a horse race between these different potential divisions in a society, and which of them has the strongest pull on a voter and is making the electorate maybe willing to live with a politician who undermines democracy. And this is, I think it's an open research question, and that I try to address by essentially doing the same kind of experiments that we briefly discussed about the United States around the world, in Turkey, and I did some in Venezuela. I am working on some in Singapore and Northern Ireland. And
you're invited to Israel anytime. We need that.
Thank you. Thank you. So one of the motivations there is precisely to get at, is it economic left-right divisions that are driving these kind of divisions, this willingness to tolerate undemocratic behavior more? Or is it precisely, as you mentioned, attitudes on immigration, so social divisions, attitudes on the traditional liberal conservative social issues? Or is it potentially ethnic divisions, right? The divisions between ethnic groups and that kind of competition. In the United States, the social dimension, especially on immigration, has a somewhat stronger pull than the economic one. But in the study that we did, partisanship, in abstract terms, simply loyalty to the party brand, social issues and economic issues score roughly the same, meaning they pull roughly the same weight when it comes to predicting voter behavior in these experiments.
That's fascinating. I mean, I would really be curious to find out what would happen if you did that experiment in Israel, because party loyalty is a thing of the past. I mean, most of our parties are new from cycle to cycle, other than maybe 3 or 4 out of, 30, 35 parties that run.
But at the same time, very few voters switch camps between elections.
And camp loyalty is much bigger, and it would just be very interesting to see you repeat that experiment here. One of the things I liked about your book was that you juxtapose two kinds of non-democratic regimes, and one that we haven't talked about too much in our series about democracy and populism and authoritarianism, and that is straight-out dictatorship. It made me curious about, how do you draw the line between democracy, backsliding, and authoritarianism, and between authoritarianism and dictatorship? What are the fundamental features? We don't need to spend too much time on that, because my real question is, what is the danger that a once democratic country moves all the way to the other end of the spectrum?
So you just asked a question that I think if you brought 10 political scientists as guests, each of them might give you their favorite criteria and their favorite measurement technique and thresholds.
But we're asking you. We trust you.
maybe to highlight what I think is really important and maybe overlooked when thinking about democratic backsliding. To introduce this answer, when we talk about democratic backsliding, there's a language of regime types that both academics and journalists frequently use. We talk about hybrid regimes, about defective democracies, about electoral authoritarianism, competitive authoritarianism, a lot of labels that try to highlight the fact that these are no longer democratic countries or badly dysfunctional democratic countries, but at the same time, they are maintaining an element of competitiveness. And this is a tough tension to square when it comes to drawing a line between a competitive regime and a non-competitive one, right? Because we still have elections, they are somewhat competitive, but the playing field is clearly uneven so that we can no longer speak of perfectly democratic competition. There's one distinction that I think is, though, key there. And maybe to highlight it, I would contrast Turkey and Russia. Turkey is a place where the incumbent has a huge home advantage when competing in politics. It's a place that many describe already as a dictatorship. But what is key about Turkey is that up to very recently, Erdogan has not dared to attempt to overturn an election that he has lost. There is no election day fraud in Turkey. And this is key because what this means that even if you are, as a Turkish voter, massaged by the media, as a candidate, you face a huge disadvantage because the incumbent can use state resources and so on. Nonetheless, when that voter votes in Turkey, that vote counts exactly as cast. And that's very different from Russia, where pre-election manipulation, in the many ways that we see it, happens. But crucially, in Russia, there is no guarantee that when you cast your vote, it will actually be counted as cast. We know electoral fraud happens in Russia, and a lot of it happens. And that I see as one fundamental difference. In a place like Russia, the only way for the public to resist authoritarianism may be to stage a protest. Basically what we saw in Belarus after the fraudulent election a few months ago. In Turkey, sometimes in a place like Turkey where votes count as cast, all you have to do is go vote and vote the incumbent out.
What's really the difference at the end of the day for the people themselves and the democratic system? I mean, of course, it's a much different place on the spectrum, but I mean, you can't expect them to put. You can't expect Turkish people to put up with it, even though they do have that power within them.
Yeah, let me maybe bring up one example, and this is an election that took place in Turkey in 2019. This was an election for the mayor of Istanbul, which was held in March 2019. It was an important election because Istanbul is the commercial center of Turkey. It's an electorate of 11 million people. And this is also a place where Erdogan started his political career. He served as the mayor of Istanbul. And what happened in this election is that initially, the governing party candidate, the AKP candidate, lost that election by about 14,000 votes. The governing party, challenged the conduct of the election with the Turkish Electoral Commission, ultimately managed to have the election overturned, meaning annulled. It was rerun 3 months later in June 2019. And then many thought this is when the AKP is really going to make sure that they win. They're not going to let it slip away by a difference of 14,000 votes or so. Instead, what happened? They lost by around 800,000 votes. Right? So this to me is evidence that even in a place that many describe as an electoral authoritarian regime, Turkey, the public can act against injustice and undemocratic behavior. And in this case, the Istanbulites showed that they are not willing to put up with a government that not only manipulates elections at the pre-election stage, but tries to overthrow them once they end up in a way they don't like. So I am actually very optimistic about the ability of ordinary people to ultimately use the ballot box as a way of disciplining aspiring autocrats.
Okay, so you're optimistic about the ability, but I have to ask you, in light of your research and in light of your documentation of the frequency of executive takeover by executives who were voted in, what about the electoral will to preserve democracy? What if, ultimately, there are simply large communities in the world, including in existing democracies, of people who conclude that democracy as we know it, as we think about it, is not that important to them? I mean, I hear this said, and I think we have to take that into account. So I want to know what you think about that.
This is, I think, ultimately an empirical question. That is, when faced with the many competing political considerations that a voter has, right? Having a competent government or having a government that promotes a direction for their country that they want to have, where do these other considerations, positional, ideological, symbolic ones, where do they rank compared to preserving democracy? And I think that is the tough question that we need to answer, and that ultimately might be country specific. And one proposition I have about that is that ultimately this is what is made worse when we have deep divisions running through societies, what people call polarization, because that's when we know that it's not only any single voter that is willing to make trade-offs between democracy and other political considerations, but that the electorate as a whole may simply be unwilling to put a stop to politicians who undermine democracy, precisely because they value or they fear the other side coming to power more than they worry about their own side undermining democracy.
Yeah, I mean, maybe people like us who really value the principles of liberal democracy, maybe we're just out of luck in light of history. I mean, sorry to presume about you.
No. So I think that maybe I would point to the historic trajectory that I tried to point to earlier, which is that the world used to be much starker when it comes to the contrast between dictatorship and democracy. And so when we look at democratic backsliding today, we think it's very new and it's bad, but we are not. I think, any democracy that disappears, of course, is one too many. But crucially, the world used to be, I think, a much starker. You used to have much starker divisions between dictatorship and democracy than we have today.
And we should also remember there simply were fewer democracies in the past. We're starting from a much better point to begin with.
Yes, and so in light of, in the 1990s, the world may have reached a historical peak in the absolute number of democracies. In other words, there's many more democracies to go back to dictatorship than there ever were, historically speaking, beginning with the 1990s. So in other words, if we just count democracies, it might appear like there's a lot of them going in the wrong direction. Compare this to, let's say, the middle of the 19th century, when actually the first attempt to overturn a democracy by an incumbent happened. So this is Louis Napoleon in France. At that time, it was just the United States, Switzerland, France, and maybe the UK, if you count the UK at the time as democratic. Right. So that one case accounted for potentially 1/3 or 1/4 of all democracies. The share of democracies that backslide today, in absolute numbers, it's a worrying number. As a share, I think it's actually way smaller than the numbers would lead us to see.
Okay, well, on this rather optimistic note, we'd like to thank you very much, Milan Svolik, a professor of political science at Yale University. Thank you so much for coming on today.
Thank you for having me.
And also many thanks to Itai Shalom, the manager of TLV1 Studios, and our producer Ariel Cohen. And once again to the Israel office of the Konrad Adenauer Foundation for their partnership and support for this series. And now we've got a request, because many or most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcasts app, and we would like to ask you to please consider writing us a review of any kind. You too can support us by going to our website and subscribing onto our Patreon campaign. You can check out our archive. It has way over 600 interviews to keep you entertained and hopefully annoyed. You can like us on Facebook and follow me, Dalia, and the Tel Aviv Review podcast on Twitter. Join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, from me and from Dalia, goodbye.